Grumpy Old Crone with me, Annie. Just for a bit of a change, I'm not actually going to be moaning about anything for half an hour like I normally do. What I wanted to do in this run up to Samhain was share a couple of weird little instances of things that have happened to me. I find them inexplicable and kind of interesting at this time of the year when the veil is thinning. So the first thing I wanted to share is quite a personal one, and both of my parents are gone now, but my dad, when he was with us, was Welsh, and he was brought up in the valleys and moved to the Essex coast when he was a teenager for work reasons, and met my mum, settled down, and that's why I have an Essex accent. However, his childhood was very heavily valleys based, and when he got a little bit wound up or went back to Wales, the accent came flooding back. He never ceased to be a Welshman, and instilled a pride in that part of our heritage to all of us kids as well. So when I had my son, we had all the normal conversations in the family that you do when you're going to have a baby, and one of them was about what we're going to call grandparents. And my son was the second grandchild in our family. My nephew had already been born, and we thought we would just follow the naming conventions that had happened there, which were the naming conventions that had come down through our side of the family anyway. So my mum was going to be a nana, and my dad was going to be granddad. So it's nanny and granddad was what we expected would happen. And as my son was born and started growing up, it was always nanny and granddad. When we spoke to him, it was granddad's going to come and visit, nanny's going to come and visit, and even though he couldn't speak at this point because he was quite young, he'd never heard anything other than those names being used for those members of his family. Now, my son learned to talk relatively early, and my parents came to visit not long afterwards, and they came in, and we had been saying to my son, nanny and granddad are going to come and visit, and he was very excited about that. And when he spoke to us, he spoke to nanny and granddad are going to come and visit. I'm looking forward to seeing them, going to the park with granddad, all of this kind of stuff. But as soon as my dad walked into our house, my son, at, I don't know, how old was he, 18 months, something like that, a year, 18 months, looked at my dad, put out his hands, ran into his arms and said, "Dadô, Dadô." Now, this isn't a case of a child who couldn't articulate the word granddad, because he'd been using the word granddad to us prior to my dad arriving. But as soon as my dad was there, all my son would call him was Dadô. And we were slightly weirded out by this, not as weirded out as my dad was. My dad was white as a sheet when he heard this, picked my son up, gave him a big hug, and we tried to reinstill the granddad. No, that's the wrong name. Granddad's here. Granddad, we're going to put on a cup of tea for granddad. And my son just kept saying, no, Dadô, Dadô, Dadô. And my father was really off. And eventually my son went off to go and find some Lego or something to play with, come back and show. And I said, "What's wrong, Dad?" And he said that word, Dadô. He said, "That's what I call my grandfather." And his grandfather was the one who brought him up. He was his de facto father. Now, my son's middle name was the same as this grandfather. who had been named specifically for that purpose, because when my dad's own biological father kind of stepped out of the situation, his grandfather stepped in and did the raising, and was a bit of a hero, doing a job that he never intended to do, but made an absolute fabulous job of it. And my dad said, yeah, Dadô, that's what I called my grandfather. That's, in our family, that was Welsh for grandfather, Dadô. And from that day to this, and my dad has been gone a long time now, but from that day to this, my son won't call or refer to my dad as anything other than Dadô. We didn't teach him to say this. We didn't even know that this was a thing. I don't speak Welsh. I was brought up in Essex. Whilst I had a connection to the Welsh side of my family, I certainly didn't have any Welsh language or any real connection with the people there in terms of going and speaking to them. So it just kind of came out of nowhere. And when my daughter was born, she did the same thing. Dadô. Always Dadô. And interestingly, when my brother's son had his own family, he also started referring to my brother as Dadô. And all of the men in the family from that first grandfather have all been Dadô. Whatever we've tried to do, however we've tried to change our children, Dadô. So I don't have an explanation for that. We didn't tell him that. We didn't teach him that. He wasn't old enough to have read it anywhere. He wasn't old enough to have seen it on the television. We didn't watch S4C Welsh language channel, and I don't actually know if it's necessarily a really common name for grandfather, but yeah, Dadô. I kind of liked it. We always thought that maybe the first Dadô was standing over the crib, watching over my son, and saying, Dadô, that's the name, Dadô. So there you go. That's the first of these little Samhain stories. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye.